He was given a simple choice: marry a stranger or lose everything he'd ever known. It wasn't a question, it was a command, delivered in a parlor that smelled like old money, old leather, and old sins. Outside, the Colorado sky was bruised purple, threatening a storm. But inside, the real storm had already broken. His father, Calvin Briggs, was a man carved from the unforgiving land he ruled, a cattle king with a heart of iron and eyes that saw everything in terms of profit and loss. Right now, he was looking at his only son, Thomas, as a loss. "You think this is about love?" Calvin's voice was flat, like dirt packed over a grave. He lit a cigar, the smoke curling around his head like a foul halo. "This is about legacy. It's about land." Thomas stood there, hat in his hands, mud on his boots, his jaw clenched so tight he could feel his teeth grinding. He was 26 years old, but in this room, in front of this man, he was still a boy. "You'll marry the Hartwell girl," Calvin said, his back to him, "and that's the end of it." Thomas hadn't even met her. He didn't know her name. All he knew was that her family's land, 2,000 prime acres, bordered their own, and that her parents were dead. "Her land becomes your land." "Our land," Calvin growled. "She's the last of her line. No brothers, no cousins, just a deed with her name on it. This is how empires are built, boy. Not with soft hands and softer hearts." Thomas finally found his voice, a dry rasp. "And if I refuse?" Calvin turned, and the look in his eyes could have frozen hell over. "Then you ride. You ride until you can't smell the smoke from our chimneys, and you forget the name Briggs. I'll have no son too proud to secure what my father and his father bled for." The threat was real. Thomas had seen his father disown his own brother over a petty land dispute 2 decades ago. Family was just another asset to be kept or discarded. A knot of defiance tightened in his gut. He had to ask. He had to know what kind of life he was being sentenced to. "What's she like?" Calvin took a long drag from his cigar, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "What does it matter? She's a means to an end." He paused, his eyes glinting with something ugly. "But since you asked, they say she's plain, unpleasant. Some even say she's cursed, that the consumption that took her parents was no accident of God, but something she brought upon the house. Cursed." The word hung in the air, heavy and cold. "They say she's got a face that could sour milk," Calvin added, twisting the knife. "But your eyes don't need to eat, boy. Your legacy does." He laid out the final terms. The wedding was in 2 days, a quiet affair at the Hartwell place. Thomas was to live there, to make sure the girl didn't get any funny ideas, until the deed was securely transferred. It was a prison sentence disguised as a marriage proposal. Thomas looked past his father, at the portrait of his grandfather hanging over the mantel. A hard man with cold eyes, just like his son. The weight of 3 generations pressed down on him, suffocating him. He felt the walls of the parlor closing in, the smell of leather and smoke choking him. He gave a single curt nod. There was no other choice. As he walked out, his father's final words followed him like a curse of their own. "Just get the land, son. The rest is just noise." But Thomas had a sinking feeling that the noise was about to get very, very loud. He was riding into a stranger's life to claim her legacy, armed with nothing but his father's greed, and the chilling rumor that his future bride was not just ugly, but a curse on her own bloodline. The Hartwell homestead was a place where hope had come to die. It crouched against a barren hillside, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, its porch sagging like the shoulders of a defeated man. It was a house that was actively mourning. As Thomas rode up the gravel path, every crunch of the stones under his horse's hooves sounded like a step closer to his own tomb. He'd spent 2 days in a whiskey-fueled haze, trying to drink away the image of the sour-faced, cursed woman his father had described. He expected a hag, a crone, a creature hunched over in grief and resentment. He expected to be repulsed. He was prepared for the worst. But he wasn't prepared for her. The door opened before his knuckles could even touch the wood, and the woman who stood there shattered his father's lies in a single, silent moment. She wasn't ugly. She wasn't plain. She was stark, like a winter landscape. Her face was all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. But those eyes, they were the color of a stormy sky, and they looked at him not with fear or anger, but with a calm, unnerving intelligence. They were eyes that saw right through you, down to the bone, down to the rotten core of your intentions. "You're Thomas Briggs," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was low and steady, without a trace of warmth. He just managed to touch the brim of his hat. "Miss Hartwell." "It's Elena," she corrected him, stepping aside. "And you can save the pleasantries. We both know you're not here for a social call." The inside of the house was just as stark as she was. Clean but empty. Furniture was draped in white sheets, like a congregation of ghosts. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and a profound, echoing loneliness. He followed her down a hallway lined with portraits of her ancestors, their severe faces judging him from behind dusty glass. He felt like a thief, an invader. In the kitchen, she poured 2 cups of coffee with brisk, efficient movements. She didn't offer him cream or sugar. She just slid a chipped mug across the worn wooden table. "You could have said no," she said, her gaze unwavering as she sat across from him. The accusation stung because it was true. So could you. A flicker of something, pain maybe, crossed her face before it was gone. "No, I couldn't. A woman alone doesn't keep 2,000 acres for long in this territory. Not with men like your father circling." She took a sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving his. "He's been waiting for my father to die for years, hasn't he?" The bluntness of it stole his breath. "I'm not my father." "Aren't you?" she challenged, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're sitting in my kitchen, about to take my name and my land, all because he ordered you to. You look like him. You sound like him. What makes you different?" He had no answer, because she was right. He was a coward, a puppet on his father's strings. The coffee tasted bitter in his mouth. "I could leave right now," he said, the words feeling hollow even to him. She nodded slowly, her eyes holding a glint of something that looked like disappointment. "You could. Your horse is outside. No one is stopping you." It was a dare, a test, and they both knew he was going to fail it, because as much as he hated his father, the fear of being cast out, of being nothing, was even greater. Just then, a knock echoed through the silent house. Elena didn't flinch. "That'll be the Reverend. Right on time." She stood up, smoothing down her simple dark dress. "I hope you're ready, Mr. Briggs. You're about to get everything your father ever wanted." She walked out of the kitchen, leaving him alone with the ghosts of her family and the chilling realization that this woman was not the victim he'd expected. She was a fighter, and he'd just walked, willingly, into her territory. He had come here thinking he held all the power. But as he sat in her family's kitchen, he had the distinct, terrifying feeling that he was the one who had just been trapped. The ceremony was a funeral for 2 living people. It took 7 minutes. Reverend Patterson, a man with worry etched into his face, rushed through the vows as if the words themselves were cursed. Thomas and Elena stood side by side in the ghostly parlor, 2 strangers bound by a contract of greed. They didn't look at each other. They didn't touch. They spoke their lines, signed the papers, and just like that, she was Mrs. Briggs and he was the master of a house that despised him. When the Reverend scurried away, silence fell like a shroud. "I'll take the spare room," Thomas said, breaking it. "Good," Elena replied, already unpinning the simple veil she'd worn. "Supper is at 6. Don't be late." And so began their life together. A cold war fought in silence across a dinner table. They were ghosts in their own home, orbiting each other but never connecting. He worked the land during the day, his land now, technically, mending fences, tending to the small herd of cattle she'd managed to keep. She ran the house with a rigid, almost military precision. They were business partners, nothing more. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Not just by Elena, whose stormy eyes seemed to miss nothing, but by the house itself, by the stern faces in the portraits. He started to understand why the townspeople whispered about her. There was an unnerving stillness to her, a self-possession that felt unnatural. She never complained. She never cried. She simply endured. He started noticing things. The way she would sometimes walk the property line at dusk, her hand resting on an old gnarled fence post, her expression unreadable. The way she meticulously maintained her parents' graves, a small, lonely plot behind the house. And he noticed the locked door, an old, heavy oak door at the end of the upstairs hallway. It was the only room in the house he hadn't been in. "What's in there?" he asked her one night at supper. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "My father's study," she said, her voice flat. "It's locked." "Why?" "Because I locked it." The finality in her tone shut down any further questions. He started having nightmares. Flashes of fire, the smell of smoke, whispers in the dark that he couldn't quite make out. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He felt like he was losing his mind, trapped in this loveless, haunted marriage. The truth was, he was more afraid of his wife than he had ever been of his father. Calvin Briggs was a monster he understood. Elela Nina was a mystery he couldn't solve. His father had warned him she was cursed, and now, living under her roof, Thomas was starting to believe it. He felt the curse settling into his own bones, a cold dread that never quite went away. Then came the night the sky bled. He woke up choking on the smell of smoke, thick and acrid. His first thought was that he was dreaming again, but then he heard it, a sound no rancher ever wants to hear, the terrified, high-pitched screaming of horses. He flew out of bed and to the window. What he saw turned his blood to ice. A wall of orange and red was consuming the northern pasture, moving with terrifying speed toward the barn. The dry grass, starved by a month without rain, was acting like gasoline. The fire wasn't just burning, it was hunting. His mind went blank with panic, all thoughts consumed by a single primal instinct. "Elela nena!" He hammered on her bedroom door, his fist pounding against the wood. "Wake up! The pasture's on fire!" The door swung open instantly. She was standing there in a plain white nightgown, her hair unbraided and falling around her shoulders like a dark cloak. There was no panic in her eyes, only a grim, terrifying focus. She looked at his face, then passed him toward the window, and seemed to understand everything in an instant. "How bad?" she asked, her voice impossibly calm as she was already reaching for her work clothes. "It's moving fast, toward the barn." The words tumbled out of him. "The hay, the animals." "I'll get the animals," she said, pulling on her boots with practiced speed. "You start a fire break. The tools are in the shed. Go." She didn't wait for an answer. She was a whirlwind of motion, grabbing a wet cloth to tie around her face, her movements sure and steady. As she ran past him and down the stairs, he realized with a jolt that she wasn't afraid. It was as if she had been preparing for this her entire life. He shook himself out of his stupor and ran. Outside, the heat was a physical blow. The roar of the fire was a living thing, a hungry beast devouring their world. He worked like a man possessed, digging a trench with a shovel, his muscles screaming, his lungs burning with smoke. He saw her then, a silhouette against the inferno. She was moving with a dancer's grace, cutting the horses loose from the barn, her voice a low, calming murmur that somehow cut through the roaring flames. She led the panicked animals toward the creek, her small frame an anchor of calm in a world of chaos. But the fire was too fast, the wind too strong. The firebreak wasn't enough. The flames leaped across the trench as if it wasn't even there, licking at the dry timber of the barn. "The house!" he screamed, his voice raw. She was already moving, dragging the heavy garden hose as he worked the pump handle, his arms burning with the effort. They soaked the walls, the roof, the porch where he imagined her mother once sat. They worked side by side, a silent, desperate team, their bodies moving in a rhythm born of pure survival. The fire raged around them, a hellscape of orange light and suffocating smoke. He lost track of time, of everything but the fight. At some point, as the flames closed in, a burning beam from the collapsing barn roof crashed down, right in her path. He didn't even think. He tackled her, throwing them both to the muddy ground as the fiery timber landed exactly where she had been standing. They lay there for a second, gasping for air, his body shielding hers. The heat was unbearable. He could feel the fire singeing the back of his shirt. He looked down at her. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes wide, reflecting the flames. And in that moment, under a sky of fire, he saw it. Not gratitude, not fear, rage, a cold, hard fury that seemed to burn hotter than the flames around them. As dawn broke, the fire had passed. The barn was a smoldering ruin. The pasture was a blackened wasteland. But the house, scarred and scorched, was still standing, and they were still alive. They sat on the porch steps, sharing a dipper of water, too exhausted to speak. The silence between them was different now. The Cold War was over, replaced by the weary camaraderie of soldiers who had survived the same battle. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. "You saved my life." "This is my home now, too," he replied, the words feeling true for the first time. She looked at him, her gaze intense. Most men would have run. He thought about that. He thought about his father, who would have calculated the loss and cut it loose. Most men don't know what they're fighting for. As he helped her clean a small cut on her hand, his fingers brushed against a strange raised scar on her wrist, hidden beneath her sleeve. It was an old burn, shaped like a brand, a single distinct letter. B for Briggs. He looked from the scar to her face, a thousand questions exploding in his mind. But then he saw something in the ashes of the barn, glinting in the morning sun. He walked over, his boots crunching on the charred ground. He knelt and picked it up. It was a small silver flask, dented and blackened, but still intact. He opened it. A faint smell of expensive whiskey, the kind his father always drank, hit his nostrils. And on the side, engraved in elegant script, were the initials, C.B. Calvin Briggs. The fire hadn't been an accident. It was a message. Or worse, it was an attempt to wipe them both off the map. He looked back at Elelanina, who was watching him with those unreadable eyes. And the chilling thought hit him like a physical blow. Maybe the curse wasn't on the land, or in her blood. Maybe the curse was the man whose name they both now shared. And maybe, just maybe, his new wife knew a whole lot more about that curse than she was letting on. The Harvest Festival was a loud, desperate party, a town's attempt to forget that winter was coming. Thomas had no intention of going. The whispers that followed them in town were bad enough. He didn't need to see the pity and suspicion on 100 faces at once. But Elelanena insisted. "We need a new bull," she stated, not asked, over breakfast a week after the fire. "The Hendersons are selling their prize stud at the auction. We need to show people we're rebuilding, that we're not broken." He looked at her, truly looked at her. The fire had changed something between them. They still slept in separate rooms, but the silence was no longer a weapon. It was a space they shared. He found himself watching her, admiring the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. He saw the way she doctored a sick calf with gentle, sure hands. He saw the way her ledgers were balanced to the penny. She wasn't just surviving, she was fighting. "People will stare," he warned. A small, grim smile touched her lips. "Let them. I've been stared at my whole life. I'm used to it." She met his eyes, a challenge in her own. "The question is, Mr. Briggs, are you?" And so they went. Elelanena wore a simple blue dress, her mother's, and she'd pinned her hair up. She didn't look beautiful, not in the way the banker's daughters did, with their ribbons and lace. She looked powerful, like a queen surveying her territory. Thomas found himself walking taller beside her, a strange sense of pride swelling in his chest. The whispers started immediately. He saw the sideways glances, the hands covering mouths. He could hear snippets. The fire, so convenient. Calvin must be furious. That poor boy, trapped with her. He felt his hands clench into fists. But Elelanena seemed oblivious, her spine straight, her chin high. Then they ran into Martha Henderson, the town's chief gossip, a woman whose tongue was sharper than a skinning knife. "Elelanena, dear," she gushed, her smile dripping with false sympathy. "And Thomas, how wonderful to see you out. I was so heartbroken to hear about the fire. Such a tragedy." Her eyes, small and beady, raked over them. "Still, I'm sure your father-in-law will help you rebuild. Calvin Briggs always takes care of his own." The implication was clear. They were a charity case, a failure. Before Thomas could speak, Elelanena answered, her voice as cool and clear as well water. "We're managing just fine on our own, Martha. The insurance will cover the barn. And Thomas is a better carpenter than anyone gives him credit for. But Martha wasn't done. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You know, it's the strangest thing. My husband was talking to the sheriff. He said it's a shame about the fire, especially coming so soon after the other tragedy. She looked directly at Ella Lenena. He said consumption is a terrible thing, but he's never seen it take two healthy people so fast. Almost like it wasn't consumption at all. The world seemed to stop. The noise of the festival faded into a dull roar in Thomas's ears. He looked at Elena. Her face was a mask of stone, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. A flicker of raw, undiluted hatred. Martha, sensing she'd hit a nerve, pressed on. It's just a blessing you weren't home when it happened, dear. A true blessing. What did that mean? He thought she was here when her parents died. That was the story. Thomas stepped in front of Elena, shielding her with his body. His voice was low and dangerous. I think you've said enough, Martha. The woman recoiled, startled by the venom in his tone. She scurried away, back to her flock of gossips, no doubt with a fresh new story to tell. Thomas turned to Elena. Her composure was cracking. Her hands were trembling. What did she mean? He asked, his voice gentle. What was she talking about? Elena wouldn't meet his eyes. She stared at the ground, her jaw working. She's a venomous old crow. She means nothing. Elena. He put a hand on her arm. Her skin was ice cold. You weren't here when your parents died? She finally looked up at him, and the mask was gone. Her face was a storm of grief and rage. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. I was in Denver, visiting my aunt. I got a telegram. By the time I got back, they were already buried. The doctor, a man on my father's payroll, had already signed the death certificates. Quick and clean. Consumption, he called it. A cold dread washed over Thomas. A convenient death. A quick burial. And a father who had been coveting this land for years. His father's flask, found in the ashes. The rumors about her being cursed. It was all a lie. A carefully constructed story to isolate her, to make her seem dangerous and unstable, so that when Calvin Briggs swept in to take her land, no one would question it. But it was worse than that. Martha's words echoed in his head, almost like it wasn't consumption at all. He wasn't just married to a stranger. He was married to the daughter of two people who had likely been murdered. And the man who almost certainly had them killed was his own father. The drive home was silent, but it was a heavy, suffocating silence. The truth sat between them, a monstrous, unspoken thing. When they pulled up to the house, he turned to her. We need to talk, he said. She just nodded, her face pale. That night, she unlocked the door to her father's study. The room was untouched, covered in a fine layer of dust. It was a simple, masculine room, a large oak desk, shelves overflowing with books on agriculture and law, maps of the territory on the walls. It felt like a room holding its breath. Elena walked to the desk and pulled out the bottom drawer. It was empty, except for a small, leather-bound journal. Her father's. I found it when I was cleaning out his things, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She handed it to Thomas. I've read it 100 times. I think you should too. His hands trembled as he opened it. The entries were mostly about the ranch, the weather, the price of cattle. But then, in the weeks leading up to his death, the tone changed. October 12th, CB rode over again today. Made another offer on the north pasture. Told him again it's not for sale. He didn't take it well. There's a hunger in that man's eyes I don't like. A greed that's rotting him from the inside out. October 19th, woke to find the creek dammed. My cattle are without water. No proof, but I know it was Briggs's men. This is getting dangerous. Sent Ella Lanina to her aunts in Denver. She's safer there until this blows over. October 24th, a man from the railroad came by today. Offered a fortune for the land. Said they need a right-of-way. He mentioned he'd already spoken to Calvin Briggs, that Briggs was facilitating the land acquisition in the valley. They're working together. The journal fell from Thomas's hands. It all clicked into place. The land wasn't just for grazing. It was for the railroad. And his father wasn't just a greedy rancher. He was a monster, willing to do anything. sabotage, intimidation, murder, to get what he wanted. Elena was kneeling on the floor, her hands resting on a loose floorboard beneath the desk. With a grunt of effort, she pried it up. Underneath was a small, hidden compartment. From it, she pulled a tin box. She opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a stack of letters and a single silver bullet. My father knew they were coming for him, she said, her voice shaking with a rage that had been simmering for months. He wrote to his lawyer. He documented everything Calvin did. The threats, the sabotage. He told me about this box the day I left for Denver. He said if anything happened to him, the proof was here. She looked at Thomas, her eyes blazing. Your father didn't just want my land, Thomas. He murdered my parents for it. The fire, that was for me. He thought he could scare me away or kill me and make it look like another accident. But he underestimated me. She stood up, her small frame seeming to fill the room. When your father came with his disgusting proposal, I saw my chance. I knew if I married you, I could get inside. I could get close to him. I could find the final piece of evidence I need to see him hang. Thomas stared at her, his mind reeling. This whole time he thought he was the one trapped in this marriage. He thought he was the one with no choice. But he was just a pawn, a key she had used to unlock a door. His name, the name he hated, was the one thing that had protected her, that had given her the time she needed to plan her revenge. So this was all a lie? He asked, the words tasting like ash. The partnership? The fire? Everything? The fire was real, she said, her voice softening for the first time. And you weren't what I expected. She took a step closer to him. I married a Briggs to destroy a Briggs. But the man I've been living with, he's not his father. The room was silent. He looked at the evidence in his hands, at the woman standing before him, a woman who had orchestrated this entire charade, who had lived a lie for months, all in the name of justice for her murdered parents. He should have been angry. He should have felt betrayed. But all he felt was a profound, burning shame for the name he carried, and a terrifying, awe-inspiring respect for the woman who wore it now. What do you need? He asked, his voice steady. What's the final piece? She looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. I need a confession. I need someone who heard him say it. The sheriff won't act on the word of a grieving daughter against a man as powerful as Calvin Briggs. Thomas nodded slowly, a plan forming in his mind. A terrible, dangerous plan. He was going to have to walk back into the lion's den. He was going to have to confront his father, and he was going to have to make him talk. He won't talk to you, he said, but he'll talk to me. He looked at her, his decision made. He was no longer just a Briggs. He was her husband, and it was time to act like it. Tomorrow I ride to my father's ranch, and I'm going to get you the justice you deserve, or die trying. Riding onto his father's land felt like crossing into enemy territory. The air was thicker, the sky darker. The ranch hands who'd known him his whole life now looked at him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. He was the boy who'd married the cursed Hartwell girl. He was an outsider now. He found Calvin in his usual spot, enthroned in his leather chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The ghosts of Briggs passed, staring down from the wall. Well, look what the cat dragged in, Calvin sneered. Come crawling back already? Did the little witch finally run you off? Thomas didn't rise to the bait. He stood before his father, hat in his hands just like he had weeks ago. But this time there was no fear in him, only a cold, hard resolve. I know what you did, Thomas said, his voice level. Calvin's eyes narrowed. I've done a lot of things, boy. You'll have to be more specific. The Hartwells, Thomas said, letting the name hang in the air. I know you had them killed. The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate a man. Calvin took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving his son's. He didn't look shocked or angry. He looked disappointed. You always were soft, Calvin said, a sigh escaping his lips. Just like your mother. You see the world in black and white, good and evil. But out here, there's only one color that matters. Green. The green of money, the green of land. Old man Hartwell was standing in the way of progress. He was a stubborn old fool who couldn't see the future. It was a confession, so casual, so utterly devoid of remorse. It made Thomas's stomach turn. The railroad, Thomas said, pressing his advantage. You're in bed with them. You're clearing the way, and they're paying you for it. A slow, predatory smile spread across Calvin's face. He stood up, the sheer bulk of him casting a long shadow across the room. Smart boy, finally putting the pieces together. The railroad is going to make this valley rich, richer than you can possibly imagine. And I will be the one holding the keys to the kingdom. The Hartwell place was the linchpin. Without it, the whole deal falls apart. He walked over to a large map on the wall, a map Thomas had never seen before. It showed their combined ranches with a thick red line drawn straight through the Hartwell property. They're not just building a track, son, Calvin said, his voice dropping with excitement. They're building a depot, a town. This land, he slapped the map over the Hartwell pasture, is where the money is. And you sentimental fool, you were supposed to deliver it to me. You set the fire, didn't you? Thomas's voice was a low growl. You tried to kill us. Calvin shrugged, a gesture of casual indifference. The girl was becoming a problem. I thought maybe a little scare would be enough to get her to sell. A tragic accident. You were collateral damage. A shame, but business is business. The cold-bloodedness of it was staggering. He was talking about murdering his own son as if he were talking about selling a cow. You're a monster, Thomas whispered, the words catching in his throat. Calvin laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. I'm a businessman. I'm a king. And you could have been a prince. Instead, you chose to shack up with a dead man's daughter in a broken-down shack. You chose love over legacy. He spat the word love like it was a poison. She's my wife, Thomas said, the words feeling truer than anything he'd ever said in his life. She's a loose end, Calvin corrected him, and I'm about to tie it up. He walked back to his desk and pulled open a drawer. When he turned back, he was holding a pistol. It was aimed directly at Thomas's heart. You're not leaving this room, boy, Calvin said, his eyes as cold and dead as a winter sky. You know too much. You've made your choice, and now you'll live with it. Or rather, you won't. Thomas's mind raced. He was trapped. He'd walked right into his own execution. He had the confession, but it would die here with him. You won't get away with this, Thomas said, stalling for time, his eyes darting around the room, looking for any way out. Get away with it, Calvin chuckled. Son, I am away with it. I own the sheriff. I own the judge. In this valley, my word is law. And I say my son had a tragic riding accident this afternoon. Such a shame. He was distraught over his wife, you see. The poor girl, she just couldn't handle the grief. Took her own life a day later. It's all very neat. He was planning to kill them both, to erase them. Thomas braced himself for the shot. He closed his eyes, an image of Elena's face flashing in his mind. He'd failed her, but the shot never came. Instead, he heard a different sound, the click of a hammer being cocked. He opened his eyes. Standing in the doorway that led to the veranda, half hidden by the heavy curtains, was Elena. She was holding her father's old hunting rifle, and it was aimed directly at Calvin Briggs's head. Drop it, she said, her voice shaking slightly but filled with deadly intent. Calvin's face went white with shock, then purple with rage. How did you get in here? I followed my husband, she said, her eyes never leaving her target. I didn't trust you to let him leave alive. I was right. Thomas stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. She had followed him. She had saved him. For a long second, no one moved. It was a standoff. A father, a son, and the woman who stood between them. Then behind Elena, another figure appeared in the doorway, a man with a silver star on his chest, Sheriff Miller, and he was holding a shotgun. I heard everything, Calvin, the sheriff said, his voice heavy with disgust. Every last word. It's over. Calvin looked from his son to Elena to the sheriff. The king was cornered. The empire was crumbling, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He was a trapped animal, and trapped animals are the most dangerous. Instead of dropping the gun, he swung it, not towards the sheriff, not towards Elena, but back towards Thomas, his own son. If he was going down, he was taking his greatest disappointment with him. No! Elena screamed. 2 shots exploded at once, the sound deafening in the enclosed room. Thomas felt a searing pain in his shoulder as he was thrown backward. He hit the floor hard, his head slamming against the wooden boards. The world tilted, fading to black. The last thing he saw before he passed out was Elena, standing over the body of his father, the smoking rifle still in her hands, and on her face an expression of terrible, final, and absolute justice. He woke up to the smell of lavender and clean sheets. Sunlight streamed through a window, and for a moment he had no idea where he was. Then the pain hit him, a dull, throbbing fire in his left shoulder. He was in his own bed, in the Hartwell house. Elena was sitting in a chair by the window, cleaning her father's rifle. She looked up when he stirred, her face unreadable. "You're awake," she said. "What happened?" he asked, his voice a dry croak. "The sheriff took him away," she said simply, "or what was left of him." She paused in her work, her hands still. "My shot hit him in the chest. Yours grazed your shoulder. The doctor said you were lucky." She was the one who had shot his father, not the sheriff. The final act of vengeance was hers. "He's dead," she nodded. "Justice is served." She finished cleaning the rifle and set it aside. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything that had happened. The murders, the lies, the fire, the final bloody confrontation. "I married you to destroy your father," she said quietly, not looking at him. "I used you." "I know," he said, and he found that he didn't care. "You did what you had to do." She finally looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Vulnerability. Tears welled up, spilling down her soot-stained cheeks. "He killed them," she whispered, the words choked with the grief she had held back for so long. "He took everything from me." Thomas pushed himself up, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder. He moved to the edge of the bed and reached out, his hand covering hers. Her skin was cold, but her hand didn't pull away. It gripped his, tight. "He didn't take everything," Thomas said softly. "He didn't take this house. He didn't take this land. And he didn't take you." They stayed like that for a long time, as the sun set outside, painting the scarred land in hues of gold and rose. The war was over. The ghost could finally rest. The weeks that followed were quiet. The valley was buzzing with the news of Calvin Briggs's downfall. The railroad deal collapsed. The empire he had built on greed and blood crumbled into dust overnight. Thomas, as his only heir, inherited it all. The main ranch, the cattle, the money. But he didn't want it. One crisp autumn morning, he and Elena rode over to the main ranch. He signed the papers, breaking up the massive Briggs empire, selling off parcels of land to the very families his father had squeezed for generations. He sold the cattle, paid off the ranch hands with generous severance, and then he took a single match from his pocket. He stood before the grand house, the parlor where his life had been signed away, and he set the curtains on fire. They stood together on a nearby hill and watched it burn. They watched the leather chairs, the smoky parlor, the portrait of his grandfather. All of it turned to ash and smoke, a final cleansing fire. He was erasing the name of Briggs from the valley, wiping the slate clean. When it was over, when the house was a smoldering ruin, he turned to Elena. "It's done," he said. He felt lighter than he had in his entire life. He was no one's son. He was no one's heir. He was just a man. "What now?" she asked. He took her hand. "Now, we go home." They rode back to the Hartwell place, their place. As they approached, he saw that the apple tree by the kitchen window, the one her mother had planted, the one that had survived the fire, was heavy with fruit. That night, for the first time, he didn't go to the spare room. He followed her to her room, and she didn't close the door. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was born from lies and forged in fire. It was a partnership that had grown into respect, and a respect that was slowly, quietly, turning into something more. They were two broken people who had found a way to heal each other. They rebuilt the barn stronger than before. They bought the Hendersons' prize bull and started to grow their herd. The land, once a source of so much pain and death, began to heal under their careful hands. They were no longer the Briggs family or the Hartwell family. They were something new, something they were building together. One evening, months later, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. He was finally her husband, and she was finally his wife. Not by contract, but by choice. He turned to her, the question that had been sitting in his heart for weeks finally finding its voice. Elela nena, he said, I think, I think I'm falling in love with you. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him with those stormy eyes of hers, the ones that had seen so much darkness. Then, a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. A real smile, one that reached her eyes and made them shine. What took you so long, Thomas? She said. It turned out that his father was wrong about everything. Legacy wasn't about land or money. It was about what you build, who you protect, and the love you fight for. It wasn't a story of an empire. It was the story of a home they had saved and a home that had, in the end, saved them. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places, and that true strength isn't about the power you inherit, but the justice you create. If you were moved by Thomas and Alelena's fight for their home, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what dark secrets we'll uncover next.